Okay, so remember that the midterm exam is on Monday. Does anybody have any specific questions over the essay or over the other parts of the? Okay.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. You need to stop apologizing though. It's a bad habit. I have that habit as well.
Okay, the shop vacuum. The shop vacuum you were using has just spewed dust into your face. Describe the movement of air and debris as it moves from the vestibule all the way into your alveoli.
Okay. So the vestibule has what that kept to capture large particles? Hair, right? Yeah. And then the nasal conchi produces mucus, but it also creates turbulence. And so that actually causes some debris to settle out. And so then you get mucus, right, that has debris in it. And then that moves towards the throat, and then you swallow it. So you're kind of always producing mucus, like in your sinuses and in your nasal cavity, right? And then it goes into the, down through the pharynx and into the trachea. You could also talk about the tonsils that are associated with the pharynx and how that actually provides a first line of defense for microbes that you might inhale. But it also can lead to allergies, right? So that's kind of bad. And then when it gets into the trachea, the mucus is produced, but it has to move back up to the throat. We don't want mucus accumulating in the alveoli. And so mucus is produced, but the cilia move it back up into the throat, and then we swallow it. So we talked about how if that cilia is destroyed, how we have chronic coughing, like smoker's cough. And then once it gets into the alveoli, there are no more mechanisms for actually getting it out of the alveoli. So we have to rely upon macrophages. And so the macrophages in the alveoli actually help to eat anything that gets that far to the respiratory membrane. Yep. Any other questions? You can also ask them Friday, because we're going to meet again on Friday. Okay. So let's talk about the regulation of the gastric juice. And so remember we were talking about how it is in the stomach that we produce hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen and pepsin, ultimately. And also remember that some of that digestive juice gets sent into the small intestine, and the small intestine has to neutralize it. So it's really important that we don't overproduce gastric juice, but we don't underproduce the gastric juices either. So what kinds of meals will stimulate more gastric juice to be produced? Not salty. Salt will actually destroy the mucous membrane. What does pepsin digest? Proteins, right? So if you eat a meal high in proteins, you're actually going to get more gastric juice produced, okay? So we could say that one thing that regulates it is the type of food. Okay, so high in protein. Okay. So I always say it's really hard for me to digest. Like I can't hardly digest steak anymore because I'm on those acid reducers and I don't eat it very often, and so it's really hard for me to digest it. So it feels like it sits in my stomach for a long period of time when I'm digesting it. Okay, so the type of food that increases secretion. Right. We can also look at neural regulation. So if you think about the autonomic nervous system, what division of the autonomic nervous system controls digestion? Well, that's the enteric. I was going to say enteric, but if we look at parasympathetic versus sympathetic, which one controls digestion? Parasympathetic, right? So we have the parasympathetic division, and there is one cranial nerve that extends down from the head region and into the body. And what is that cranial nerve called? It's the one cranial nerve that comes down from the brain, because remember that the parasympathetic is only cranial and sacral. And so it actually comes down from the brain and it goes to the digestive system. Does anybody remember? This is called the vagus nerve. Right? So stimulation by the vagus nerve increases secretion. Right? So that's neural regulation. We also have hormonal regulation. So it's kind of interesting because the digestive tract itself can produce a hormone, and this hormone is called gastrin. And gastrin is produced by cells that line those gastric pits that are with the parietal and sheath cells. And this is produced by the enteroendocrine, so inside the lining, endocrine cells. Right? And so if more gastrin is produced, this is actually a positive feedback. It will actually cause more gastric acid to be produced. So this increases gastric acid production. Okay. Now we also have, so these are stimulatory, right? So both of these actions are stimulatory. We also have inhibitory. So one thing that inhibits the production of more gastric juice is the acidity in the duodenum, in the small intestine. So if we have too much acidity or too low, let's see, not too much, a decrease, sorry, a decrease in the pH in the small intestine, this will decrease the production of gastric acid or of gastric juices. And what this does is this protects the small intestine. So it's protective, right? So if the chyme that's coming in is too acidic, right, there's a mechanism that will inhibit the release, and this is actually sympathetic, right? So this is sympathetic because the sympathetic nervous division also innervates the digestive tract, and it is inhibitory. So sympathetic is the fight or flight. So it shuts down the production of gastric juice. So I don't know about you, but I always hate going to meetings that are contentious, like, right? And they serve you food and you're like, yeah, right. I'm gonna wanna eat when my sympathetic system is on high because I'm gonna have to get in a fight with you over something. And so I have to eat, but then my gastric juices are not being produced, right? And so everything just sits there and does not get digested, right? So inhibitory is the sympathetic nervous system. So in your book, they have a diagram that shows, you don't need to know all of this, but it shows first, it's kind of interesting, just the sight and thought of food. So it is true that when you're just like, if you're hungry and somebody starts talking about food, like somebody last night, I hadn't had dinner and it was like they were in lab and it's like 7 o'clock and they're talking about ordering Chinese food. Oh, so right, so my stomach just starts producing gastric acid, right? And then I start to get acid indigestion because there's no food in there, right? So just the thought inside the food can cause the stomach to start secreting, and it also can start it to move, right? So it churns, and that's when your stomach growls, right? So your stomach will start to growl. And then notice how the food presence, if there's lots of protein in the food, and also caffeine. So caffeine actually also activates the release of gastric acid. Then you'll have greater gastric acid. And notice that we also have, when our stomach gets stretched, so we have little stretch receptors in our gut. And so when our stomach gets stretched, we can sense that, right? We can sense being full, but that stretching also activates the vagus nerve, okay? And then, so this is all on, this is stimulatory. Inhibitory, right, would be if you have lack of stimulatory impulses, if gastrin decreases, and then this is the one I talked about, where you have too much acidity, right, in the small intestine, in the duodenum in particular, then that is going to shut down the production of the gastric juices, okay? So there's both a neural mechanism and a hormonal mechanism, and both stimulatory and inhibitory. Okay, so let's look at the small intestine. So the small intestine, the first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum, or some people pronounce it duodenum. I'm not sure what is right, but I always said duodenum. Maybe it's where you're from. So that's the duodenum. This is the first part. And so this is where pancreatic juice enters. Okay. And this pancreatic juice has in it inactive enzymes. So for example, it has trypsinogen. Okay. Now, once it gets into the small intestine, we have enzymes that are in the small intestine wall that will then convert that trypsinogen to an active form, and this is called trypsin. Okay. So trypsin is, the enzymes that convert it are called let me look at my notes, sorry. Where is it? Oh, I don't have it. Oh, pepsidase. I think it's called enteropepsidase. Enteropepsidase. I think that's right. So pepsidase, that ACE is an enzyme, right? And that converts trypsinogen to trypsin. And so trypsin is important in protein digestion. And then this trypsin, I wish I had my image, but this trypsin then actually activates an enzymatic cascade. So the presence of trypsin causes another activation of another enzyme, and then the presence of that enzyme causes another activation of another enzyme, and those are all functioning in protein digestion. So protein digestion does not just occur in the stomach. It also occurs in the small intestine. So that would be important to put in your essay questions on digestion. Okay, we also have things like lipases, right? So these break down lipids. And then we have pancreatic amylase. So pancreatic amylase is, breaks down carbohydrates. And then we also have things that are called nucleases. And the nucleases break down DNA, for example. So it's kind of interesting, the DNA that you take in a meal, like a cow's DNA, is going to be ultimately broken down and then used by your body. And it could be used to produce your own DNA, right? So you can reuse, these would be nutrients that could be reused. Okay. So the next part, this is a relatively small part of the small intestine, so a short part of the small intestine. So this is the duodenum right here. So this is the pancreas, this is the pancreatic duct, right? And there's one main pancreatic duct, and then there is an accessory duct, okay? And then this would be the duodenum. And I actually have an image here that I want you to look at. So label the pancreas and the duodenum on here, and also the gallbladder. So it looks like the pancreas is just kind of hanging out there by itself, but it is actually in a mesentery. And the stomach would be right there as well. So it's kind of in the mesentery that surrounds the stomach. So this is the pancreas, the yellow, and then the main pancreatic duct is right here. And then this is the accessory duct. And then this part of the small intestine, that first part of the small intestine, which connects to the stomach, is called the duodenum. And then you could label the gallbladder on there as well. The green is the bile duct. So you just need to know that this is the bile duct right here. And then this that connects the bile duct to the gallbladder is what is referred to as the cystic duct. Okay, so you need to know the cystic duct, the bile duct, and then the two pancreatic ducts. So remember that bile is actually, we'll talk about this, but bile is produced by the liver, but it gets stored in the gallbladder. So the other thing that happens in the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, is that we get the emulsification of fats, so the mechanical digestion of fats, so the lipases, the chemical digestion, can take place. So the next part of the small intestine is what is referred to as the jejunum. And then the last part is called the ileum. So those are the two other parts of the small intestine in order. And in these parts of the small intestine, we have absorption of nutrients. And so to absorb nutrients, we need to make sure that we have epithelial tissue that will be good at absorbing it. And so we have columnar, simple columnar epithelial tissue. Which is a single layer of column-shaped cells. And so if we look at the lining, we see of the small intestine, we see that it has a huge surface area. So I'm just going to draw this. You can draw it if you want in your notes. These are the folds. Right? So we have folds. But if you looked at the fold up close, so if I magnify this part right here, right, it would actually look like this. So we actually would have folds upon folds, and those are what are called the villi. So those are the villi fingers, and they're lined with that simple columnar epithelial tissue. And then if we looked at one villi, right, we have on the surface cilia. So this would be one villi, right? And we have cilia, and this is what is referred to as the microvilli. So this would be ciliated. Okay, so those are the microvilli. So this is the huge surface area that, like, if you undid it, it would be like the tennis court, right? Huge surface area for absorption. Now, we do have some diseases, and specifically one that seems to be more prevalent today than in the past. When we look at celiac disease, this is an autoimmune disease that specifically destroys the villi. And so what you generally get with celiac disease is you get people that can't gain weight, and then they become malnourished, right? And it seems to be related to a gluten allergy. Now, it can have other effects, like you could break out in hives as well, right? But celiac disease is a gluten allergy. And so then if you remove the allergy, right, the villi can rebuild themselves. So it's not a permanent problem. And it is kind of related to what is called the irritable bowel syndromes and Crohn's disease. But the irritable bowel syndrome can occur anywhere in the digestive tract, whereas celiac disease specifically deals with the small intestine and those villi. Okay, so if we look at a diagram that shows that, right? So these are the folds that I drew, and then you have the folding upon the folding. And then if you looked at the villi, they have microvilli on them. Okay. So when we talk about the absorption of nutrients, this takes place at the level of the villi. So the villi have two different vessels that come into them. So they contain capillaries. And anything that is water soluble is absorbed by the lining and then passed into the capillaries. So this would be water soluble nutrients. So this would be like glucose, right? This would also be amino acids. So we've broken them down into their smallest constituencies, right? And we can, nucleic acids, right? We can absorb them. Okay. So once they get into the capillaries, then they are in the circulatory system. And instead of going right to the heart where they get pumped out again, there needs to be some kind of filtering of these nutrients. And so we have what is referred to as the hepatic portal system. So from here, it's transported to the liver via the hepatic. So liver means, or hepatic means liver, portal, and these would be veins. Portal means that it's going from one organ to the next without going back to the heart first. So most veins are carrying blood back to the heart, but a portal vein is going from the small intestine to the liver, okay? And we're gonna talk a minute about those portal veins, okay? So if we look at the villi, they also contain lacteals. And what are lacteals a part of? What system? System contains the lacteals? Does anybody remember? This would be lymphatic. So that's always drawn in green in your book. And so these lacteals absorb lipid-soluble nutrients. So I always think of this as being like precautionary. Like if you ate, you know, you went to McDonald's and you had a Big Mac and a French fries and a milkshake, you would have so many lipids that you would absorb into your blood. And so instead of passing it into the blood first, which it could clog up everything, right? It goes into the lymphatic system. So your cholesterol and all your triglycerides get broken down, and instead of going right into your blood, they go into the lymphatic system where they get kind of diluted in the lymphatic system. So that's another function of the lymphatic system, is that it absorbs lipid-soluble nutrients. And so we get these fat droplets, and they cover them with enzymes, or protein, sorry. So plus proteins, and they produce a complex, which is called a chylomicron. You know, and it's a small micro, chylo, I'm not sure where that comes from. But a chylomicron is just a fat droplet plus proteins, and this actually makes it soluble in the lymph. And so remember that the lymph is transported up to near the internal jugulars, where they are passed back to the circulatory system. Okay. So let's look at a diagram that shows that. absorption of nutrients. So this is showing the absorption of water-soluble nutrients. So these amino acids come in, they're broken down, proteins come in, they're broken down by these amino acids, and then they have to go through that columnar cell, and then they get picked up by the capillaries that are in the lacteals. Okay, so if we look at the capillary system in the lacteals, there's a little capillary bed in each of the villi. The green here is the lacteals, right? And so if we look at the absorption of lipids, oops. This one. Okay. So fatty acids can go right through the plasma membrane. They don't have to use channels. And so they go in there and then they get packaged by the Golgi apparatus, right? And then that Golgi apparatus adds proteins. So we have these globules, proteins, to form what are called the chylomicrons, right? And then they go into the lymphatic system where they're transported. Okay, so the difference is between water-soluble versus lipid-soluble nutrients. We talked about celiac disease. Okay, so let's talk about the liver. So if you look at the diagrams that I provided you with, and I thought let me see if I can, did I not save it? That's crazy. Okay. I thought I saved a one of these. But if we look at the liver, this is one of the diagrams that you see. Let's see. Oh, I don't even have the diagram. I didn't save my latest version of my lecture, obviously. Okay, we'll just have to look at it here. Okay. So that structure down below, when you look at the posterior side of the liver, which is in your bottom diagram, that is your gallbladder. We also have these ligaments, which are kind of interesting when we're going to do the dissection of the fetal pig, and those ligaments are actually leftover umbilical veins. And so when blood goes out to the placenta and picks up nutrients, it comes back to the fetal liver. And those are obviously not needed when we're born. And so instead of having an open vessel here, those old blood vessels turn into ligaments, okay? And so you can see in your diagram, let's see if I can find my diagram maybe. No, I don't have it. Okay, so you can see in your diagram that you have oh, this is really important. I'll just have to point to it on the diagram, on the picture. Okay, so you can see this big blood vessel. Okay, that is called the inferior vena cava. Okay, so the big blood vessel is the inferior vena cava. And then we have the hepatic veins coming off of that big blood vessel. So you see the hepatic veins?
Can you point to it one more time?
The hepatic veins are coming off this big blood vessel. Okay, down below we have a big vein. Well, it's not a big, but it's a smaller vein. And that is called the hepatic portal vein. The hepatic portal vein. And I could open up my document here. Let me do that. This will help, but I still can't use it, I don't think. Documents. What? Can't even get to my documents. Okay, anyway. Okay. Okay, so let me look at this. So the smallest vessel there is the arteries. So that's the hepatic artery, and it is carrying nutrients to the liver itself, right? And then do you see the one that is connected to the gallbladder, right? The gallbladder one, that is the bile duct, okay? So the gallbladder is connected to the bile duct. Okay.
So is that portion that runs between the gallbladder and the
that's called the
That's the
cystic
cystic
duct.
duct,
That's the
right?
cystic duct. So the cystic duct is this little duct right here, and you can see it on this one. This is the cystic duct right there. And then you have above it the bile duct, right? And then you also have the hepatic portal ducts, and then you have that little one down below. This is the artery. Okay, so this is the artery. Okay. Okay, so let's look at the liver. So the liver is super important because it does a lot of things. So can anybody list something that the liver does?
filters?
Okay, so it filters the blood. So it does this, it removes toxins. And one toxin that it removes is alcohol, for example. And so I'll show you a little video that talks about what happens if you consume too much alcohol. It can cause the liver to die and be replaced with connective tissue. It also produces or removes glucose. And it produces and stores glycogen. So glycogen is just a polysaccharide of glucose. So it stores that as glycogen. It also removes amino acids. And it produces proteins. So it produces these proteins. And so examples of the proteins that it produces would be the clotting factors that we talked about when we were talking about the blood. And we also talked about albumin previously, because albumin is a protein that's found in the blood that increases the solute concentration of the blood and actually leads to the osmotic pressure difference, which draws water into the blood vessels, okay? So those are some things that it does. It filters the blood. It also produces bile. And we talked about the significance of bile. Okay, so let's look at the microscopic anatomy of the liver. So the working part of the liver is called a liver lobule. And this is hexagonal in structure. And so it looks something like this. Okay. So this is a microscopic. So this would be like if you're looking at the tissue underneath the microscope, you'd see all these hexagonal structures in there. And then at each of these corners is what is called the portal triad. Right? So we have inside the cell, inside of this hexagonal structure, we have a central canal. Right? And then we also have hepatocytes. So we have plates of cells called hepatocytes. So those are hepatocytes, are just liver cells, and they're the ones that do all the functioning, right? So they're the ones that filter the blood. They're the ones that remove the glucose, destroy the toxins, produce the proteins, and then everything comes in the portal triad and it comes out through that central vessel. So if we look at a diagram, the diagram that I gave you, oh, and it's not, sorry, it's a central vein, not canal. I knew it was, it's a central vein. Okay. So this is your diagram. So if you look on the back page, right, it shows that hexagonal liver lobules, right, not to be confused with the big liver lobes, which there are 4 of those, but these are thousands of them. So this is the portal triad. So blood comes in from the circulatory system into what is referred to as the portal venule. So you could label this one, doesn't matter where you label them, but so you could label this one the portal venule. So this is nutrient-laden blood. This is from the small intestine. So notice how the blood travels through these plates of hepatocytes, and then it gets into the central canal, where then it combines with other larger vessels to eventually leave the liver. Okay, so that's the portal venule. We also have a structure here called the portal arteriole. Oops, yeah, that's right, sorry. Our portal arteriole, right? And this contains oxygen-rich blood supplied to the hepatocytes so that they can do their work. And then the last one would be the bile duct. So the hepatocytes also produce bile. And so the bile is going to filter into the little canals, those bile caniculi, and then ultimately meet up with that bile duct, which is then going to merge into larger and larger bile ducts and then go to the gallbladder and also the duodenum. Okay, so this is what is referred to as the portal triad. The portal venule, the portal arteriole, and the bile duct are at each of those 6 corners that are on a liver lobule. And so this canal, right, is the blood that goes back into that inferior vena cava and then back to the heart, where then it gets pumped out to the lungs and gets oxygenated. So this is the working unit of the liver. Okay, the pancreas is also an accessory gland. And so we have as part of the pancreas, we have an exocrine portion. And this produces enzymes. And the cells that produce these enzymes are called acinar cells. Exocrine means that it is like the salivary gland and it is like the sweat gland. It travels, it puts its stuff into ducts, right? We also have in the pancreas endocrine portion, right? And this produces hormones. And the cells that produce hormones are called the islets of Langerhans. So think islands of Langerhans. This is the guy who discovered them, right? And so most of the pancreas is the acinar cells, but embedded in there are these little islets which produce the hormones. And remember that the pancreas produces, we looked at it when we were talking about the endocrine system, it produces insulin and glucagon. So those are the 2 parts, or the 2 hormones that act antagonistically to one another to regulate blood glucose levels. Okay. So they act in opposition to one another. So in your book, they have pictures of the pancreas, right? So this would be the acinar cells, and notice that they are surrounded by a duct, right? So it's the rough endoplasmic reticulum that produces these enzymes, and then the enzymes get secreted, and then they go into the larger pancreatic duct. And then if we look at this tissue, this is actually shows the actual duct, and then these are the acinar cells. And I think I have a picture. No, I don't. So the islets would just be sitting in the tissue. Okay, so those are they would be in the islets of Langerhans. Okay. So then next, so after absorption of nutrients occurs and chemical digestion and mechanical digestion occurs in the small intestine, we end up at the large intestine. And so we have a valve, which is called the ileocecal valve. And it's called this because it is near the ileum, which is small intestine, right? And the cecum. So the cecum is a part of the large intestine, and it is blind-ended. So it's a blind-ended pouch off the large intestine. And its function is to store good microbes. Right? So we actually have microorganisms in our large intestine that we have to have in order for things like blood to clot, right? So for example, we have a type of E. coli in our large intestine. You think E. coli is bad, but there are some strains of it that are not pathogenic that actually are good, and they produce vitamin K. And this is essential for blood clotting. And we're actually just beginning to understand how important the other microbes might be besides just this example. So there is some evidence that the microorganisms that you have in your digestive tract and in your large intestine can determine the weight, your amount of body weight. So what they've done is they've looked at people that are obese versus people that are not, and they found that people that are of normal healthy weight will have a different set of microorganisms than people that are really heavy. And so there's a lot of research going into what all these good microorganisms might be doing for our body. And so that's the idea behind all those probiotics, is to feed all these good microorganisms so that you can stay healthy, right? So that's just one example. So off of the cecum, there's actually the appendix. So the appendix is attached to the cecum. And it is has an immune function, right? So we have all these good bacteria, but we need to kill off and destroy the bad bacteria, and that's the function of the appendix. Sometimes the appendix will rupture, and then you get bacteria just going into your body cavity, into your peritoneal body cavity, and causing massive infections, and you can die from infections when you get peritonitis, when you get your body cavity full of microbes. So if we look at a diagram of this, you need to know, right? This is the appendix right here. This is the ileum right here. And then right here is the ileocecal valve, right? So this is my blind-ended pouch right here, which has houses my good bacteria. Now, if we look at the way the food has to move, it actually has to go up, right? And then it has to go over, and then it has to go down, right? And so that, remember we talked about peristalsis and how important the movement of the smooth muscles, the contractions, in aiding the movement of that stuff through. Okay? So when we look at another function of the large intestine, right? In the large intestine, we have the reabsorption of water. And this is really important because if we don't have the reabsorption of water, we have diarrheal diseases, and that can cause dehydration really fast, and it can lead to death, right? So dehydration in a diarrheal disease like cholera. Right, and that can lead to death pretty rapidly. Okay. We also have the formation of feces. And one of the things that was alluded to in the video that we watched is that feces are brown because of the presence of what? Bile, right? So bile causes the brown color. Without bile, feces are actually white, or kind of like it's kind of grayish. So if you've ever had a bowel movement where your feces are grayish, or you've ever seen a bowel movement where the feces are grayish, that's because they're not producing bile. And they're generally really fatty too, because without the bile, they can't absorb the nutrients, and so the feces will have a lot of fat that did not get digested. Okay, so you can tell a little bit about digestion by looking at the color of the feces. Now, I forgot to mention something about those good bacteria that I wanted to, and there is a disease that is kind of a problem specifically in older populations, and this is called it's a bacterial disease called C. difficile, or C. diff, right? This is a bacteria that does cause diarrhea, right? And it generally is very, very difficult to treat with antibiotics. So that's hence this difficile, right? I think that's probably why they named it that. So it tends to be antibiotic resistant. Okay. So one way that they could, or they've discovered that you can treat C. difficile is through what is referred to as a fecal transplant. Right. And so this is where you take the feces, and generally it's of somebody that might live with the person, somebody that's closely related to them, and then you use an enema, right? And so you take the feces and you mix it in with water, and then you put it into the females, or the individuals, not females, the individual's digestive system, right? So the fecal transplant puts good bacteria. So the good bacteria outcompete the bad. And so this has been like a total game changer, according to the media, stories that people tell about C. difficile in older people, right? It's like, oh, it's like a miracle, right? So now, instead of doing a fecal transplant, what they want to do is they want to be able to put the good bacteria in a pill and be able to take it, and that's less, you know, it's less gross than doing an enema, right? Okay. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you the video. And the video talks specifically about the liver and what happens when the liver becomes damaged by excessive toxins, excessive fat. Sometimes people who are obese have liver damage, right? And then excessive alcohol as well.
Then we have the regulator of our energy needs. This is where proteins, fats, and carbohydrates not put to immediate use are sent. Centrally located above the intestines and below the diaphragm, the liver is a multifunction workhorse. It's a storage battery, recycling center, health club, and detox unit all rolled into one. The liver is made up of a forest of blood vessels that connect millions of tiny working units. These working units preserve the body's delicate chemical balance, making the liver one of the most complex and well-run factories on Earth. The moment the digested sugars from body sandwich enter the liver, they are met by teams of enzymes, here imagined with mechanical arms. The enzymes grab onto the glucose molecules and assemble them in a chain called glycogen. These chains, connected together, form balls of glycogen, the body's pet pills. They're stored in the liver and throughout the muscles. Between meals, the liver converts the glycogen back to glucose and releases it into the bloodstream to supply the body's energy needs. The steady flow of glucose is essential, not only for champion athletes, but for all of us. The brain, for example, runs entirely on glucose. Too much or too little can have effects ranging from minor disorientation to coma or even death. The liver is also able to manufacture many different proteins. These boost muscle and bone growth and give blood the ability to clot. The liver's protein factories, here lit up like spaceships, are called ribosomes. The snake-like ribbons flowing toward them are messenger RNA molecules, each one carrying the blueprint for the assembly of a single protein. In a fantastic display of assembly line engineering, building blocks called amino acids are hooked together in a precise order to form long protein chains. Inside the ribosome, the protein chains are further processed into a stable form that will allow them to perform their assigned tasks in the body. A million proteins are produced every minute. With the new protein complete, it's time for the rollout, out of the liver and into the bloodstream for distribution. For the blood, the liver serves as both health club and detox unit.
So you can see the plates of hepatocytes and the blood running through them.
If there is too much cholesterol in the blood, the liver removes the excess, recycling some of it into bile. The bile and some leftover cholesterol are then shipped to the gallbladder. And here's the detox unit. These beautiful crystals are benzopyrene. They're found in cigarette smoke and car exhaust. Getting a good look at a poison like this, the liver sets up a machine shop, engineering an enzyme to clean up the toxic spill. It can do this for many dangerous substances, up to a point.
You know, sometimes I can have like one beer and it's weird. I don't know whether it's just being an athlete or what. It feels like it goes right into my legs and my legs feel funny from that. You know, so that's sometimes where, you know, that's something you almost try to tend to stay away from a little bit, especially during that, you know, especially during heavy competition season.
Under normal conditions, the body can process a small amount of alcohol with no problem. The trouble starts when things are taken to excess. A few drinks and an empty stomach can have an immediate negative effect. The alcohol gets past the mucous membrane and kills some cells in the underlying blood vessels, causing bleeding to occur. Aspirin and excessive amounts of salt can do the same thing. Seen under the electron microscope, the damage to the stomach wall appears devastating. But the body has an answer for these everyday assaults. The undamaged cells surrounding the injury rally to the cause, stretching out their tendrils until they reach one another, making a healthy net over the damaged area. This quick repair process takes about 30 minutes to complete, if it's not needed too often. In the liver, these lobes are in more serious trouble. Weakened by virus or parasites or the long-term effects of alcohol, they are unable to process all the food that is entered. Instead, the food turns to fat, here tinted blue. The fat fills the liver lobe until the cells burst. The dead lobe is replaced by simple connective tissue, and some of the liver's working capacity is lost. The surviving liver cells must do even more. If they too are overstressed, more cells will die. Cirrhosis sets in. Unchecked, the connective tissue will be all that is left. When too much of the liver goes, we go with it, because there's nothing in the body and nothing we can build to replace it. These Japanese engineers tried to design a chemical plant that would work like the liver, but as they discovered, the chemical engineering carried out in the liver is more advanced than anything modern technology can offer. An enormous factory would be needed just for the energy distribution system, and handling the toxins was just overwhelming. The healthy liver takes care of us day in and day out. And like the champion athlete who makes everything look easy, its astounding abilities are sometimes overlooked.
Okay. So cirrhosis is where the liver becomes damaged and is replaced by simple connective tissue, right? So cirrhosis is when your liver becomes damaged. So your liver has the ability to regenerate itself, but if too much of it dies, then the only way that you can survive is by getting a liver transplant, right? So if you have like hepatitis can sometimes destroy the liver, but also there's this new disease which is called non-alcoholic fatty liver, NADL, and that is kind of a big problem with obesity is that people's livers are becoming damaged by the food and the diet that they eat. And so it's not only alcohol that can lead to cirrhosis. Okay, so I will see you guys on Friday. We're doing the fetal pig dissection, so you might want to wear something that you don't mind maybe getting a little bit dirty.